The rush of water resonated through the walls as I walked past my 60-year-old neighbor's bathroom. I hadn't intended to pause, yet something held me back. Before I realized it, I spoke, and those words altered everything. The ensuing events were unforeseen, entirely different from anything I could have pictured. It all started on a tranquil evening, the kind that lulled the city into a slumber. The usual hum of traffic was barely perceptible, and the gentle whir of my refrigerator filled the quiet of my apartment. I'd just returned from work, another extended day battling screen fatigue and tedium. The sun had just slipped below the horizon, painting the sky with a soft orange hue. I envisioned a peaceful evening, a simple meal, maybe a beer or two, and then collapsing into bed to recuperate from the work week. Little did I know, my plans were about to be drastically altered. As I prepared a drink, I noticed it, the distinct sound of gushing water. It felt odd, almost intrusive, louder than normal, and something about it gave me pause. I immediately recognized it wasn't the familiar gurgle of pipes from my own apartment. This emanated from next door, the apartment of Mr. Ben, my elderly neighbor. I hesitated, trying to decipher the situation. Mr. Ben, a resident for as long as I could recall, wasn't someone I often worried about. He was a constant presence in the building, consistently cordial but reserved, polite yet rarely engaging. He'd lived alone since his wife's passing a few years prior, and I understood he lacked close family. He mostly kept to himself. Our last interaction was a brief hallway exchange a few days ago. He'd mentioned enjoying a long bath, claiming he deserved it after a particularly taxing week, though it was hard to imagine what could stress someone his age. Tonight, however, the water was excessive, far too loud. It didn't sound like a typical shower. There was a forceful, relentless quality to the rushing water, unlike anything I'd heard before, and it unsettled me. I listened intently. A peculiar, muffled sound accompanied the cascading water, something like shuffling, perhaps. I couldn't be certain, but something felt wrong. Mr. Ben was a man of routine, never causing a disturbance. Why this sudden deluge, and why couldn't I hear him? Instinctively, I grabbed my phone and dialed his number, but it rang repeatedly unanswered. My apprehension intensified, and without further thought, I grabbed my jacket and keys, heading for the door. The hallway was dimly illuminated as I neared Mr. Ben's apartment. The rushing water was even more pronounced, and now I could detect a faint sound, perhaps humming. No, more like murmuring. I knocked once, twice, then 3 times, my knuckles rapping against the wood. The only response was the persistent roar of water. "Mr. Ben," I called, pressing my ear against the door. Silence. The ensuing quiet was more alarming than the noise. I tried the handle, and to my surprise, the door creaked open. "Mr. Ben," I called again, stepping inside. My shoes made soft thuds on the wooden floor. I felt like an intruder, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The air was heavy with steam, the rushing water intensifying as I advanced. I proceeded down the narrow hallway, my footsteps muted by the carpet. The bathroom door was ajar, and through the fogged glass, I could make out the faint silhouette of Mr. Ben. "Mr. Ben!" I called again, my voice raised, attempting to pierce the drumming water. No answer. It was strange. I'd known Mr. Ben for years, and he always acknowledged a knock, even if only briefly. I hesitated before reaching for the handle. Something compelled me to ensure his well-being, regardless of the potential awkwardness. I pushed the door open slowly, my heart pounding. The bathroom was enveloped in mist, so thick it obscured everything. As my eyes adjusted, I saw him. Mr. Ben stood beneath the shower stream, his face half turned towards the wall. The water cascaded down, splattering against the tiles, yet he seemed oblivious, perfectly still, lost in thought. I stepped forward, my voice trembling. "Mr. Ben, are you okay?" His head twitched slightly in my direction, but instead of a reply, he remained motionless. I was baffled. Why wasn't he acknowledging me? I moved closer, now at the shower's edge, close enough to discern his facial features through the steam. He looked peculiar, his expression inscrutable, eyes half closed, lips slightly parted. "Mr. Ben," I repeated, more firmly this time, hoping to break whatever trance he seemed to be in. Then, unexpectedly, he slowly turned his head towards me. I froze. His gaze met mine, and for a moment, I thought I recognized him, but there was something unsettling in his eyes. It wasn't his usual expression, not what I expected from the kindly, distant, and polite old man I knew. His gaze was intense, almost predatory. It startled me, my heart racing as I froze, unsure whether to retreat or speak. There was something else, too, an odd intimacy in his expression that I couldn't quite place, and it made my skin crawl. He seemed to be studying me, evaluating me in a strange, unfamiliar way. "Alex." His voice was low, gravelly, like it hadn't been used in ages. "Are you all right?" I managed to ask, my voice a mere whisper, unable to break his gaze. His eyes flickered, a brief flash of something unidentifiable passing through them before he offered a small, insincere smile. "I'm fine, Alex, just enjoying my bath," he said casually, but there was a peculiar undercurrent to his words. The way he said my name, the way he looked at me. It felt wrong. Something was happening, something I couldn't grasp. As the steam enveloped us and the sound of rushing water filled my ears, I couldn't shake the premonition that this was only the beginning. Something was off, and I didn't understand why, but I had a terrible feeling it wouldn't end here. The moment Mr. Ben turned his head, everything seemed to stop. Our eyes met through the swirling steam, and for a fraction of a second, I thought I saw a flicker of something deep and inscrutable within them. Then it vanished, replaced by the familiar, calm expression I associated with him. He smiled, a slow, almost amused smile that unnerved me, though I couldn't pinpoint why. "I'm fine, Alex," he rasped, his voice strangely soothing. "Just enjoying my bath. Don't worry about me." I didn't know how to react. The way he'd looked at me, the heavy silence in the room, it made my stomach churn. It wasn't like Mr. Ben to act so distant, so detached. Even after all these years of living next door, I couldn't recall him ever looking at me with such intensity. "Okay. I just heard the water and thought something might have happened," I mumbled, my voice weaker than I intended. I didn't even believe my own words. The rushing water, the odd sound I'd heard. Something didn't add up, but it wasn't my business, right? Mr. Ben simply nodded, still standing under the spray, his expression unreadable. A strange tension hung between us, thick and heavy, something that hadn't been there before. "You're always welcome here, Al," he said softly, his voice oddly warm. "You don't have to leave so soon." His words hung in the air, and I struggled to interpret them. There was something in his tone that quickened my pulse. Unsettling, yet inviting. It didn't make sense. Mr. Ben had always been courteous, but he'd never hinted at wanting anything beyond our casual neighborly exchanges. I nodded, swallowing hard. "Okay, I'll leave you to it then. Enjoy your bath, Mr. Ben." I turned and walked out of the bathroom, my footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. Back in my apartment, my mind raced, trying to process what had just transpired. I couldn't understand why I felt so shaken, so confused. Mr. Ben was just an old man, my neighbor. Why did it feel so strange? I tried to dismiss it as a bizarre moment, nothing more. People had odd days. Mr. Ben was no exception. But something gnawed at me. A pull, an unspoken tension, urged me to return to his apartment, to figure out what was going on. I forced myself to ignore it, to focus on something else. I ate dinner, but the food was tasteless. I kept replaying the scene in my head, Mr. Ben in the shower, his eyes on me, that strange smile. I couldn't escape it. The pull to understand what had happened, to understand this strange new connection between us, was almost magnetic. Over the next few days, I told myself it was a one-time thing, a weird interaction. But the feeling lingered, a quiet hum in the back of my mind. Soon, it became clear that Mr. Ben was a constant thought. I kept thinking about him, about his smile, the intensity of his gaze. It was like something had shifted between us, something unspoken yet tangible. It wasn't long before I found myself outside his apartment again, knocking softly on his door. The last time I'd done this, it had felt normal, just checking on him. This time, there was something else in my chest, a flutter I couldn't ignore. The door opened, and there he stood, in his usual faded robe. But this time, his appearance seemed different. Perhaps it was my perception, but there was a gentleness in his gaze that made my heart flutter. "Alex," he greeted, his voice warm yet composed, as if anticipating my arrival. "How's everything?" "Good, I stammered, my throat suddenly parched. "I just wanted to check on you again. I mean, after the other night." The water sounded a little strange. Mr. Ben smiled, and this time it felt less strained, more genuine. He stepped aside, widening the doorway. "Come in," he invited. "I'm making tea. Could use the company." I hesitated briefly, a nagging voice urging caution, yet a stronger impulse propelled me forward. Stepping inside, the familiar warmth of his apartment enveloped me. The space was small yet inviting, furnished with antique pieces and bookshelves overflowing with novels, newspapers, and various trinkets. A sweet aroma, likely the brewing tea, filled the air. "Sit down, Alex." Mr. Ben gestured towards a well-worn armchair in the corner. "Make yourself at home." I nodded, sinking into the chair, acutely aware of the space separating us. A peculiar silence descended, a palpable tension that hadn't existed before. It felt as though something had shifted between us, something unspoken. "So, what have you been up to?" Mr. Ben inquired, his tone casual, but his gaze attentive. It wasn't the same friendly look he usually wore. This time, there was a different quality in his eyes. Softer, more intimate. I shrugged, feigning nonchalance. "Not much. Just work, same old grind." "Ah, yes," Mr. Ben chuckled knowingly. "The daily grind. I remember those days. Never easy. Always something vying for your attention." He poured the tea into 2 mugs, handing me one. I accepted the mug, my hand trembling slightly. I hadn't anticipated this warmth, this openness. It felt like a connection had formed, subtly growing since our unusual encounter in the bathroom. "I'm glad you stopped by," Mr. Ben said softly, leaning back in his chair, his gaze unwavering. I noticed for the first time the depth of his eyes, the intensity of his stare. It felt as though he saw something within me, something I hadn't recognized myself. I sipped the tea, which suddenly felt too hot in my hands. "Yeah," I mumbled, unsure why, but feeling compelled to visit. We sat in silence, the unspoken words hanging heavy between us. My heart pounded, the tension palpable. It was a magnetic force drawing me closer. "Alex," Mr. Ben finally spoke, his voice a near whisper. "I think we both sense something between us. Something that's been growing. Something we don't quite understand." I froze, my breath hitching. His words were intoxicating, clouding my thoughts. There it was, the unacknowledged truth that had lingered since our first encounter in his bathroom. I remained silent, speechless. Yet I didn't leave. I didn't want to. The following days passed in this manner, and then one day I decided to visit again. A quiet, almost unsettling stillness permeated Mr. Ben's apartment. As I entered, time seemed to slow, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. The familiar scent of his home, old wood, herbal tea, and something subtly sweet, enveloped me, both comforting and strange. I'd been here numerous times, brief hallway chats, quick greetings over the fence, but this time felt different, charged, Something unspoken hung between us, fragile and threatening to break. Mr. Ben moved gracefully in his small kitchen, his joints creaking softly as he prepared tea. The rhythmic sounds, the clinking spoon, the whistling kettle, were calming, yet an underlying tension persisted. I watched him, his hands moving with practiced ease, his fingers wrapped around the delicate porcelain cup. For a moment, I realized I was staring, my thoughts drifting where they shouldn't. Why was I here? What was it about Mr. Ben that held this peculiar sway over me? "Tea will be ready in a minute," Mr. Ben announced, his voice interrupting my reverie. He smiled gently, as if understanding my internal struggle, saying nothing yet conveying everything. It was as though he could read my mind, patiently waiting for events to unfold. "Thanks," I murmured, still unsure. I shifted uneasily, uncertain where to sit. The small apartment felt smaller still as the realization dawned that this visit had crossed a threshold into unfamiliar territory. Mr. Ben hadn't invited me over like this before. The air crackled with unspoken words, too dangerous to voice. He placed the tea before me on the worn coffee table, and our eyes met. Our eyes met briefly, and the room seemed to hold its breath. I felt his gaze, not the look a neighbor or friend would give, but something deeper, far more intense. For a second, I wondered if he could hear my heart pounding in the silence. "Sit," he said softly, gesturing to the armchair opposite the couch where he'd settled. He didn't inquire about my day, didn't attempt small talk. It was as if he understood I wasn't there for pleasantries. He simply wanted my presence. I sat, my legs suddenly weak. His gaze remained fixed, and I squirmed under its intensity. I felt an anticipation, something I couldn't articulate. I inhaled deeply, trying to compose myself, but my attention kept returning to him, his quiet presence, the stillness of his posture, his unwavering gaze. The world outside this moment seemed to vanish. "You've been different lately, Alex," Mr. Ben remarked, his voice low, almost a whisper. His words held a strange knowingness, as if he'd been observing me, waiting for me to recognize something too. "What's been on your mind?" I blinked, taken aback. I wasn't sure how to respond. What had been on my mind? The question felt too intimate, but more than that. It felt like Mr. Ben was searching for something beneath the surface. I began, my voice trailing off. I struggled to explain the strange feelings churning within me. The pull I experienced whenever I was near him, the unusual attraction that had been growing since the night I found him in the shower. Was it even attraction? Or something else? Something more complex than I could grasp? Before I could finish my thought, Mr. Ben set down his tea and crossed the room in a single fluid motion, closing the distance between us. I froze, unable to move, watching as he approached, his steps slow and deliberate. There was a gentle intensity in his movements, like a predator stalking its prey, yet oddly comforting. He stopped inches away, close enough that I felt the heat radiating from his body. His breath warmed my skin, and the hairs on the back of my neck prickled. "Alex," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "You're not just here for tea, are you?" The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. My heart skipped a beat. I couldn't speak, couldn't articulate the rush of emotions coursing through me. Yet somehow Mr. Ben seemed to understand. Without another word, he reached out, his hand gently brushing my cheek. The touch was unexpected, but felt utterly natural. I closed my eyes, a shiver running down my spine. My mind urged me to pull away, to stop this before it escalated, but my body betrayed me. I leaned into his touch, savoring the warmth of his palm, the electric spark between us. His thumb grazed my lip, and I gasped, my pulse quickening. He was so close, his face inches from mine. For a moment, I thought he would retreat, but then, without warning, he leaned in and kissed me. The kiss was soft, tentative, as if we were both unsure. But the moment our lips touched, something shifted within me. It was like a dam breaking, unleashing a torrent of emotions I hadn't realized I possessed. I kissed him back, my hands reaching for him, drawing him closer, my fingers tangling in his hair. I'd never experienced a kiss like this. It wasn't just physical. It was something more. The world outside the room disappeared, leaving only us. It was as if we were drawn together by an unseen force, something neither of us could resist. His hands wandered, gentle yet insistent, exploring my body as if he had been waiting for this moment forever. I didn't understand what was happening, how we'd arrived here, but I didn't care. The tension between us finally snapped, replaced by heat, desire, and the desperate need to be close to him. I briefly considered pulling away, stopping before it went too far, but then I felt his lips on my neck, his breath warm and enticing, and all rational thought vanished. He pulled back slightly, his eyes searching mine, as if seeking my approval, my consent. I didn't know what had compelled me to let things progress this far, but in that moment, all I could focus on was the connection between us, the spark ignited from that first touch. I nodded, barely able to breathe, and he kissed me again, deeper this time, the kiss growing more urgent, more desperate. My mind spun, my heart raced, and as I lost myself in the kiss, I couldn't help but wonder, what was this? What had we begun? But there was no turning back. The night had taken a turn, and we were both caught in its current. The room was silent, except for the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the soft whir of the air conditioner battling the summer heat. The heat radiating between us was far more intense, suffocating in a way I hadn't foreseen. Mr. Ben's hand lingered on my cheek, the touch lasting longer than expected. My mind raced as the moment stretched, my body betraying the turmoil within. I didn't resist. Instead, I instinctively leaned into him, seeking the warmth of his presence, the reassuring strength in his touch. It felt so wrong, so perplexing, yet I couldn't stop myself. His thumb caressed my skin, a soft, intimate gesture that sent shivers down my spine. I met his gaze for the first time since he'd closed the distance between us. His eyes were dark, filled with something beyond the polite calmness I'd always known. There was a fire now, a hunger that quickened my pulse. "Alex," he whispered, his voice thick with unspoken words. "What are we doing?" The simple question struck me like a physical blow. What were we doing? That was the question that had been gnawing at me since I'd entered his apartment, since his gaze had held mine in the shower. I'd told myself I was just curious, just checking on an older man who had never truly been a part of my life. But now, in the silence of his apartment, it felt like we were standing at the precipice of something dangerous and unknown. "I don't know," I finally admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "I didn't expect any of this." He nodded, his fingers brushing the side of my neck. "Neither did I," he said quietly, "but here we are." For a moment, neither of us moved. The air seemed to thicken, a weight pressing down on us, holding us captive. I should have gotten up, walked away, but I couldn't. I was drawn to him, caught in his orbit. I was no longer certain of right or wrong. All I knew was that this moment felt too real to disregard, too raw to deny. Slowly, he leaned closer, his breath warm against my ear. I could feel my heart pounding in my throat, and I wondered if he could hear it too. His lips grazed my earlobe, a feather-light touch that sent a wave of heat through me. "I've never felt like this before," Mr. Ben murmured, his voice low and soft. "Not in a long time." I closed my eyes, feeling the tremor in my body as his words resonated. I had never seen this side of him. Mr. Ben, the quiet, solitary figure next door, the man who had kept his distance for so many years, was suddenly a stranger. Or perhaps I was the stranger. The man who had always lived by clear boundaries, by distance and routine, was now standing so close, his lips inches from mine. I couldn't tell if it was the heat of the moment or the intoxicating mix of curiosity and desire that made me lean in, but before I could stop myself, my lips brushed against his. It was a soft, tentative kiss, unsure, like neither of us knew exactly what we were doing, but neither of us wanted to stop. His lips were warm and soft, his kiss gentle yet persistent, drawing me deeper into him. The world outside vanished, and all I could focus on was the heat of his mouth on mine, the lingering taste of tea. It was a kiss that spoke of years of silence, years of unspoken things. It was the kind of kiss that unraveled everything I thought I knew about myself, about him, about the world we had built in the small spaces between our encounters. It was the kind of kiss that made the rest of the world fall away, leaving only us. For a moment I couldn't breathe. I felt dizzy, lightheaded, as though I was floating outside my body, caught in a whirlwind of emotions I had no idea how to process. And then, just as suddenly, the kiss broke. We both pulled away, our breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. I stared at Mr. Ben, my eyes wide with disbelief. What had just happened? What were we doing? It wasn't just the kiss. It was everything. The way he had touched me, the way he had looked at me, the way I had felt drawn to him like I couldn't escape. There was a connection between us, undeniable and powerful, and I had no idea how to handle it. Mr. Ben didn't speak at first. He just looked at me, his eyes dark and intense, a mix of emotions swirling within their depths. I could see the conflict there, the same confusion I was feeling. "I don't know what this is," he said, his voice hoarse, "but I can't deny that it's real." I didn't know how to respond. The words were caught in my throat, and all I could do was nod, feeling the weight of his words press down on me. Real. Yes, it felt real, but it also felt impossible. Mr. Ben was old enough to be my father. Hell, older than my father. What were we doing? "Maybe we should just take a step back," I said, though my voice trembled. I didn't know what I wanted, but I knew that this couldn't continue, not like this. It was dangerous. It was wrong. But Mr. Ben shook his head, his expression unreadable. "No," he said firmly. "I don't think we can just take a step back. Not anymore." I opened my mouth to argue, but he raised a hand, silencing me. "This thing between us, Alex, it's been there longer than either of us cares to admit. Maybe it's been growing for a while, but pretending it doesn't exist won't change anything. Not for you, not for me." I wanted to speak, to say something, anything, to make sense of this, to resist the force pulling me deeper into this web. But the truth was, I no longer knew what I felt. I didn't know right from wrong. I didn't know what this was between us, or what it could become. "We'll figure it out," Mr. Ben said, his voice gentler now. "But for now, let's not run from it." I was speechless. My thoughts swirled, caught in a vortex of confusion and desire. I looked at him, at the man who had lived next door for so many years, the man I had never truly seen until now. And I realized something terrifying. I didn't want to leave. Not yet. The tension between us, the weight of all that remained unspoken, hung heavy in the air, thick and palpable. Neither of us knew what would happen next, where this path would lead. But I knew one thing for certain. Things would never be the same between us. And somehow in that moment I wasn't sure I minded. I wasn't